Okay, welcome back. In this segment, I want to talk about the inspection points that your home inspector should be looking for as relates to a well head. Now, you go, and many of us go thinking that a well should look like this big thing that comes above the dirt. And in many cases, the wellhead is just going to be a little, it's only going to be the width of maybe a 8-inch diameter pipe and perhaps just a few inches above the ground. And that may be the extent of it, but because all the guts are inside. Sometimes they're even kind of hard to find. But I remember one of the ones that I did most recently, it was out in southern Utah County, and we went looking for that wellhead, and it wasn't hard to do an inspection on that one because the first thing we noticed is there was water all over the ground. Now, in that case, the question was whether that water was from the wellhead or whether it was from flooding nearby. In both cases, that's a problem. So the first thing that the home inspector should be looking for is just generally the condition of the well. You've got the casing that may or may not be visible. Now, the casing is just a fancy name for the pipe that goes down into the earth. And for a private well, that may be an 8-inch diameter casing pipe, or it may be something different, just depending on how it was done and how far they went, etc. You want to take a look at the cap, if it's corroded, if there's pathways in for bees and ants and whatever critters to get in there, especially mice. I can't, like I mentioned in the first segment, I can't tell you how many times I have seen critters and drinking water get together, and people just drink that water and think it's tasty. One thing I can tell you is that if you think that the number of, for example, mice or just decaying stuff would make it taste bad, you're wrong. Based on my experience, the water that people think is the best is the stuff that has the most decaying materials. So the condition, you've got the casing, the cap, and the pump. Obviously, a pump that's been down there for 25 years might not be in the best of condition. So you'll want to find out, or you'll want to have your inspector find out, or have the sellers provide some information about the condition and the age of that pump. Might even want to call a local wellhead technician and just find out who's been servicing that and what he knows. Next thing you're going to want to find out, and this is not going to be available from or visible from the surface, so you're going to have to go to the well log, but you want to know how deep that well is. Now, if you've got a fairly shallow well, you're basically gathering surface water that happens to flow towards the bottom of that shaft, and that surface water is going to be contaminated. It's going to have pesticides, it's going to have feces, it's going to have whatever little Janie spilled. Maybe it's going to have herbicides. Maybe you've got, who knows, whatever poisons might have been spread over the lawn, or even fertilizers. None of that is good for you in drinking water. So you're going to want to know how deep that well is. And another thing you want to look at inside the well log is what are the layers. So for example, if you've got gravel all the way down to the bottom, so you got this casing that is theoretically protecting the system and doesn't let water in until you get to the very bottom. But if you've got gravel or sand all the way down, the water can travel outside the casing all the way down to where the pump is, and you're going to be getting that nasty, unfiltered, unprotected water in that sort of a condition. So you want tighter soils, preferably clay, but silts, finer materials that make it harder for water to get from the surface where it's contaminated down to where the wellhead is. And again, if you got a shallower well, you're going to have more water problems than if it goes deeper. We're going to talk about that in another one of the segments. Another thing that you want to do as relates to depth is you don't want that wellhead right on the bottom of the pipe or of the casing, because you're going to get sediments in there. I mentioned you're going to have mice that get in there and die, or grasshoppers or whatever it is, worms, And you want to give, in order to not be sucking those things up directly, you want to give yourself a little bit of forgiveness. So you go about 10 feet off of the bottom, and that's where the pump should be. Now, all this is very technical, and it is probably beyond what a realtor needs to know, but it's helpful to have this just on your radar again, so that you know if the professionals are serving you well. In the environment around the wellhead, I've got a number of inspection points. First off is, do you see voids, also known as mouse holes? If you've got mice that are digging in around that casing, kind of scary. So you'll want to make sure that, if you see those, you want to have those mice poisoned and disinvited, and then fill in those holes so that you don't get another batch that gets in there. You want to make sure that, if there is a well house, the well house can help, but if it's ignored, somebody once told me that barns are something that you build and then ignore until they fall down. Wellheads can be like that too. If you have a wellhead with a well house above it, sometimes people store chicken feed in there, and that's going to bring mice. Sometimes they store poisons in there, or whatever goes in there. And then sometimes critters just decide to go in there because it's a house and it gets ignored, and so they make it their house. And then you're getting poop and urine and, all kinds of nastiness. So if you have that sort of an environment, the well house isn't helping, and we need to do better maintenance on that. Obviously, you don't want to sell your client a home where they've got water that is being filtered through urine and feces. Positive drainage basically means that the well house and the well head should be on a relatively high part of the land, kind of like foundations. You want water to drain away from the foundation, not towards. Same sort of thing with your well head. If you got surface water that is draining down into that drinking water, you've got a problem. So you want only to be drinking the water that is down deep in the aquifer, that has been down there for thousands of years and that is untainted, as opposed to water that is presently on the surface that might have any number of contaminants. So you do that again by making sure that if you've got your wellhead that's low and water is draining towards it, it's going to find its way into that wellhead just like it would find its way into the basement. And that's not a good thing, and you need to make sure that your home inspector notices that. Then you got to have the right distances. I've got a whole segment associated with distances, and we're going to talk about what distances should be, for example, to where a manure pile is or to where a septic system is. The casing height, especially if you're in an area where the guy might be doing flood irrigation, obviously you want the wellhead to be high, but you also want the casing height high enough so that water is not overtopping that wellhead and flowing in through the top side. It's supposed to be waterproof, but they often are not, and it's just not a risk that you want to take. Then, and I've done a couple of well proofs myself, and first thing I want to mention to you is that each local health department, they theoretically run off of the same state regs, but they run their own counties very differently. So I'm going to tell you some things that are true in some counties but are not true in others, and you're going to want to get the straight scoop from whatever county health department you belong to. Don't call the state. And I'm going to start the next segment with my story about how my experience went there, but just give you a heads up, it didn't go well. You want to make sure that you have a well log, and I'd mentioned that as we talked about some of these other things previously. But if you really don't have a well log and an inspection history and perhaps some water testing when the well was originally put in, that does put you and your client at a disadvantage in knowing that they are protected and drinking safe water.